Dr. Williams, I have been looking forward to this day since the moment I met you, and especially since there's a man on this earth that spoke prophetically into Cassie Anderson's life to end that relationship for a period of time for Josh to grow up spiritually.
I'm glad it worked out, Josh.
Oh, so is he. I can tell you that he's so glad that it worked out. I want to encourage you this morning to do what my maybe third or fourth grade teacher said, sit up straight, take out your, I have a journal that I take notes all the time. I would encourage you to take notes, put them on your phone. I'm going to write some things down. In fact, I think I titled this one already. Lessons I've learned from Dr. Cedric Williams on 9/20/20. And so I'm actually going to be taking some notes as well. I'm looking forward to this so much. And so thank you for being with us. And,
I appreciate it. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
He actually this morning thanked us for having him. And no, it's the other way around. Thank you so much for saying yes and coming here. We're going to engage in a conversation today, in an interview of sorts, answering some questions that I think are infinitely important for us as a church and for each one of us individually. And so I want to encourage you to listen carefully, take notes. You'll learn a lot today. I am confident of that. So can we dig in?
Yeah, let's jump in.
Okay,
yeah,
excellent.
Can I just say
Absolutely.
good morning, everyone. Yeah, I'm so glad to be here with my family in Pontiac. Even though I haven't met you all, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to be here and be with you as brothers and sisters in Christ. So thank you. And Josh and Jared, you guys have been wonderful to work with and talk with and to share meals with. So I'm glad and grateful for our conversation that we're going to have. I hope it's blessed.
See, I'm telling you, the first time I met him, I'm like, man, I want to listen to what he has to say. Just a few months ago, we've been in a series in Ezra, but a few months ago, we finished a long series in Ephesians, and it happened around the time that there really began to be an uptick in our culture concerning race and racial reconciliation.
Sure.
And I believe that that's God's providence that we were in Ephesians at that time, because we began to unpack what it meant to be reconciled to God first. Relationally, we were dark in sin without God. Once you have a relationship with Christ, that there's this reconciliation that takes place through Christ. But then Paul goes on and talks about reconciliation with one another. And so I just want to know a little bit about maybe your experience in the church, where maybe you've experienced the church has acknowledged that there's a need for reconciliation with one another, but where we've fallen short or been unwilling to reconcile, and whether that's racial reconciliation or just reconciling in relationship as a whole. So would you speak to that?
Yeah, kind of jumping into the meat and potatoes, I feel like, historically, when we think about the white evangelical church, right, in America, there has been a history of what we would call complicit silence in terms of racial reconciliation, right? There's in one of the articles I think that I shared with you, there's a gentleman named Jamar Tisby. He wrote a book called The Color of Compromise, where he kind of goes through the lineage of the white American church and talking about how there has just been time and generations and decades over decades of silence. And the reason why that there's silence is when you don't feel like there's anything to reconcile. When you don't feel like you're a part of the system that possibly is oppressive. There may not feel a need, or you may not feel a need to reconcile anything because I didn't break it, right? And I think that if we magnify that on a societal level, that's where we find ourselves today, where there are some people who do not feel a need to reconcile anything or a need for racial reconciliation because they do not think that they have participated in the system that has contributed to racism, racial injustice, etc. And so I think that historically that's kind of what we see, is that the church in some ways has been resistant to racial reconciliation because they haven't felt a need. And I think that a lot of times when we think about sin and we think about our own sin, sometimes there's not an awareness of it, or we don't view it as sin, or we don't view it as something that we have to ask for forgiveness for, or something that we need to come to God about, whether it be individual or on a communal level. And that's what I think that we're seeing right now.
Is there a possibility, I don't know if this is absolutely true or not, that our complicitness in this issue of racial reconciliation, that it could reach a sinful point in our life where I want reconciliation, but I'm not going to do anything about it. I haven't done anything wrong. This takes place in the big cities. We don't have that here. I'm not responsible for that. Can that turn to a sinful, or is it just maybe an ignorance? What?
Well, I think about it as far as being a Christian, and if I'm reading the scriptures, and Jesus' words in the New Testament are telling me what is sinful, what is wrong, what is impure in my heart, and I read it and I say, well, that doesn't really apply to me, right?
Yeah.
I don't really think that that's really me. I would say that that's sinful, right? Because I'm blatantly seeing something in front of me, but I'm still denying it, that it's not real, or if it doesn't apply to me, so I dismiss it. So in that way, I think it's very similar. I think that racism is a sin. I think that silence, when you see racial injustice, is a sin. Because as an ambassador of reconciliation, as an ambassador of peace, as a Christian, I think that it is not enough to say that, oh, well, that's poor them, that's something that's somebody else's problem. That is our problem as a human problem, as a Christian problem. And if we are the hands and feet, and we are supposed to be the embodiment of Jesus Christ on this earth today in the local and the global community, then I think that it is our responsibility to be a part of that change and a part of that ongoing reconciliation between God and humanity.
Great. I think with that, there's this humility that has to come from that. To recognize I've either been complicit or implicit in this, and there's a humility factor that needs to be a priority, I guess. And so when you're looking at that idea of humility, clearly from a human standpoint, it's one of Jesus' greatest characteristics.
Yeah.
Philippians 2 tells us that. He was humble, he was gentle, he was meek. And sometimes we can view that as Christians as being a weakness. But you speak to a term that I had not heard. And when we first started talking about racial reconciliation, I thought that was going to be like the top piece of the puzzle. That's the big thing you and I should talk about. You're like, dude, that's the tip of the iceberg. There's some underlying foundational things that we're missing. And you used a phrase and coined it. I don't know if you've coined it, maybe you did, but multicultural humility. And I would love for you to explain that as you explained it to us, because I learned a ton about that piece.
Sure. The term multicultural humility is really just this understanding of that exploring my own background and how I have been raised and how I have been brought up. What does it mean to hold all of these different cultural identities, and how do they affect the world that I interact with, right? So I hold a variety of cultural identities. I'm a black male. I'm a psychologist. I'm in the Army. I've been in the Army for over 18 years now. I'm a pastor's kid. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a Midwesterner, right? And all of those cultural identities that I hold, they form the way that I interact and the way that I think about the world. And so having multicultural humility is understanding that the way that you were raised, the way that you were brought up, the way that your family talks about race, the way that your family talks about work, the way that your family talks about our country or countries, the church, Christ. It's all formed through these cultural identities that we hold. And so having cultural humility is really understanding that, taking time to reflect on those cultural identities and how they impact the way that you interact with people who share those same cultural identities or who may not share those same cultural identities. So when I talk about cultural humility, that's really kind of the lens and the framework that I think about having these types of discussions. How has my life formed me in a way to be able to think about the gospel and think about racial reconciliation in that way.
We're going to go off script just a second here
That's
because of what you said there. What questions should I be asking myself? Since multicultural humility is about my story of how I interact with others, whether the same identity or different, if grown up differently. What are I might have put you on the spot. What are some
Put me on the
questions?
spot, man. That's all right.
What are some questions that you would ask yourself? What
Yeah.
should I be asking myself?
Well, I'll tell you the questions that I ask myself, right? And is what does it mean for me to grow up in Bloomington Normal as a place that is a predominantly white area as a black male? What does it mean for my parents to leave the south side of Chicago to come here in 1979 and 1980? Why? What does it mean for them to put me in a private school? Why did they do that? What does it mean for me to be an infantry officer, a ranger? As you know, I look around, and my graduating class at Ranger School was, there was like 7 black people and 200 white men. What does it mean? How does that shape me? How do I think about that? What does it mean to go to, overseas and to interact with Christians who look different than I am? What does it mean to be in a church all of my life, read scriptures, go to Sunday school, and every single picture of Jesus is a white male? What does it mean to see? How does that form me? How do I think about that? What does it mean to grow up in a place where the history books that that I see people who are reflected in me starts at slavery, as if I didn't have a whole black history that starts way in Africa, okay? Right. So all of those types of things shape you as a human being. And so those are the questions that I have asked myself over time of what does it mean to be a Christian in that way, to be formed in that way, and what do I think about that now, and how does that help or inform the way that I interact with others? Right.
Yeah, that takes.
So that's a start.
Man,
yeah,
it takes a lot of introspection, and you, someone like me who grew up in the Midwest, when I'm looking at my history, I'm thankful for it, but I also have to recognize that I might have some There's no doubt I have preconceived ideologies.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's not that there's dangers in that, but it leads us into our next piece that I want to talk about. That there's a lot of conversation about there's no better way of using the phrase white privilege, and you use the white evangelical church statement or phrase for that. And I tried to come up with an acronym real quick for the white evangelical church. I don't have one. Okay. But can you speak to that idea where I could mess up the idea that white privilege and it is paralleled with the blessings of God, and yet at the same time be very thankful for the blessings that God has given me. But has it also been because I've been a white male?
So I think that one, I think that I would tease them separately, right?
Great.
So when we're talking about the concept of white privilege is just the idea that a lot of things in the system that we live in America, you don't have to think about. They're essentially built, designed, this country for the most part, the modern part of this country, was built and designed by predominantly white males. Okay, we know that just historically. Sure. So the systems that we're in, the education, how we learn, how we think, what is considered professional, what is considered cordial, the norms that were established are based off of whiteness, right? And so having a privilege in that, people are saying that, not to say that, every white person has an easy life, but their life is different, right? When you think of interactions in the education system, when you think of the judicial system, when you think of all of those types of systems that were built, they're not necessarily built or designed for minorities in mind. Or if they were built and designed for minorities in mind, they're not in a place of prominence or a place of leadership. So when people are thinking and talking about white privilege, it's basically talking about that concept. Now, how does this play out, right? When I think, I come from a multiracial family, right? And so there's just things that I do that my wife, she has a easier time doing, right? If I'm, give you an example of, the other day I was in my house, coming out of my house, I was going into my car early in the morning, and there was a car that had stopped in front of me, and they just waited and stared at me and stared at me. I go back in. I come back out, go back into my car. The car is still staying there. This is my house, okay? Those types of scenarios, those types of instances are not an anomaly, I think, for Black people in our country. That is something that systematically happens. If my wife comes in and out of her car, nobody's staring, nobody thinks that, looks strangely about her in the neighborhood that we live in or anything like that. That's something that I live with every single day. When my kids go to church and they're doing a life lesson of listen to God, right? And when they have a life lesson of listen to God, and they have these big ears that they have, like that they've made in Sunday school, all of those ears are white, right? So the cardboard cutout of the ears are white on their black skin and brown skin, okay? Those are privileges that I think that are historically, people just take those for granted, like that's no big deal, that was a mistake, it's an oversight. Well, it doesn't feel like an oversight if you are a Black and brown person that's consistently having those types of scenarios happening on a day-to-day basis. As far as blessing goes, I think that, Jesus, the greatest, I think that the scenario that he gave about blessing was in the Beatitudes in Matthew 5. Blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who are persecuted, blessed are those that are oppressed. I think that the blessing is referring to humanity, and I think that people confuse blessing and whiteness, which implicitly means that a curse or something that is not blessed is therefore Black or therefore other. And I would say that whiteness is not the standard in the economy of God.
That might be worth writing down and retweeting. Great statement, and I appreciate that. How would you speak to me as someone who may feel guilty for that privilege or blessing? How would you speak to that?
Yeah. Once again, I would call it privilege. Like when speaking towards somebody who has privilege, I don't think it's something that you walk around with guilt about. Like, for instance, in the military, it's a structure that's typically, it's designed for men. Okay, the way that it was built is for men. I don't walk around in the military over this last 18 years and apologize for being a male. I don't do that, and I won't do that. But what I do is I try to use my privilege in order to make a way for people, for the females who are in my units, that I absolutely know 100% that they can do the job that I'm doing. So I'll give you an example of this. When I went to Ranger School, there was no females that were there. And I think that they changed that in like 2015. And so they started allowing females to be able to go to Ranger School and complete it. Leading up to that, I began to work with my battalion commander of starting to train up females in order to go. And I designed a program of instruction to be able to step in and to say, hey, look, I'm going to use my privilege as somebody who is a respected member of the military to be able to make a program that says I'm vouching for these people because I believe in them and I'm with them. Their struggle is my struggle. It's not just something that is good for them, they can go to Ranger School now, let them do their thing. No, it's something that I'm doing with them. So you use your privilege or you utilize your privilege to be able to make a way, and that's what equity is all about, right? Having, we both be able to get to the party at the same time. That's equity, right? And trying to figure out ways for us to be able to say, this is not something that you do, and that this is your problem to fix. No, like I'm using my privilege to say this is now my problem because I see something that is inequitable and I want to make a way with you as brothers and sisters.
In essence, you could leverage your privilege either way, though. I mean, you could leverage it negatively, but you're saying
Absolutely.
You're saying here's the best way is to use it in a positive way to bring others along.
Yeah, and I think that in going back to even to scriptures and I think that that's what we see Jesus doing.
Yeah.
Like look at Jesus when he, so we look at the when Jesus cleared the temple, we're thinking about like when he cleared the court of the Gentiles, right?
Right.
The Gentiles they were already on the outskirts of the temple, the
Not
way that
allowed
it was
in,
actually
yes.
designed, right?
Yep.
And so he was not only clearing it, but in my mind, is through my lens of reading that, I'm thinking this is an act of equity, of saying you're already pushed the Gentiles all the way to the court way far out. And now you've used it in order to make, some sort of like, you're exploiting them. And so let me make a way. And so I think of it in that way of how can you use your privilege, Jesus as a Jew, to be able to say, like, this is not okay. And I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to intervene. And that's what I think about when I think about privilege.
You just think of that completely differently than I do. That whole even that story. I've just thought, get rid of him. He's angry with them and everything. He's creating a way.
It's creating a way. I mean,
Yeah.
this is the only place that they had to worship. This is the only place that they had to worship, and they were being exploited in their worship.
Not allowed into the inner
Not
courts.
allowed.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think that when you have a different, you have a different framework and different, because of how you were raised and how you believe, it's the same thing for me. All of these things in my life has shaped me and has formed me to even read the scriptures in a way of like, wow, like how do we see Jesus really intervene in this? Like, is this a concern of Jesus? That's what we're always asking ourselves. Is Jesus concerned about these things as well? And I would say yes, because it is, it's about equality, it's about equity, but it's about spiritual formation and growth to be able to see people. This is not just solely a political thing, right?
Oh, for
this
sure.
This is a conversation about spiritual formation from a Christian perspective, in my opinion.
Yeah, this is about humankind. This is about
about
one
humanity.
another's, if you're going to stay with biblical terms, one another's, things like that pull us together.
Absolutely.
You used that phrase, or did you coin the phrase multicultural humility? Let's say you did.
I don't
Let's just make
know.
you even more brilliant than you already are.
No,
So,
no.
in all
I didn't.
humility,
No, I
let's
didn't.
make you more brilliant
Just
than
to
you
be
already are.
very clear, no, that's not, no.
That's a foundational piece to something I found in what you've written and what you've taught to be a really interesting concept, and that's multicultural competence. So would you speak to that and what that means when you use that term?
Yeah,
those terms?
multicultural competence is, kind of break it up in like to 4 different components. One is having that cultural humility piece to be able to reflect on your own cultural identities and how that shapes you and how that forms you. The second component of that is to have a curiosity of the other, whoever the other may be, all right? And not just like a novel curiosity of like, oh, I'm, kind of like voyeuristic of just like checking out and seeing, but being a part of and inquiring like we're doing in some way. Like this is a part of cultural competence, right? We're inquiring about how does this shape you? How do you think about these things? What does this mean to you? How are you thinking about race in social justice or social upheaval within the environment or within our current cultural context? That's the second component. The third component is really having these set of cross-cultural skills, right? Of what skills do I have to employ in order to navigate in a multicultural world? So thinking about, the term that I use is ruptures and repairs. Okay, so we have so many societal ruptures that are happening. People are angry, people are upset, people feel disenfranchised. Well, whose responsibility and whose role is it to repair that? And so when we think about cross-cultural skills, that's one of them. Another one is interdependence, of saying that if you and I are trying to achieve a common goal, but we have different cultural backgrounds, we have to work together in order to get there. So as Christians, as believers in Christ, right, if we're really looking at, you know, being ambassadors of Christ in this world, I think that that's something that we have to do interdependently of one another, that we need each other in order to move forward. And then the fourth is just the deliberate practice of those, of saying, hey, I'm going to actively engage in these acts of being humble and trying to reflect, to be curious about other people and different cultures, different backgrounds, and their thoughts on that. And then, of course, implementing cross-cultural skills along the way.
You and I talked about, I had this question about how do we reach a demographic that we, as a church, that we don't often reach out to, and something different than just trying to meet needs. You said get into relationship with them, get to know them.
Yeah.
Is that the part of that deliberate practice and interdependence to
I
work on
believe so.
relationships?
Like, I mean, I think that when you think about, I've met with a lot of churches, I've talked with a lot of churches recently in the last 6 months, and one of the things that comes up, like, yeah, we want to, like, you know, start reaching out to different minority groups, different demographics, and then the conversation really divulges really quickly into, let's increase our benevolence fund.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
Let's increase our food pantry, and let's expand our food pantry. And once again, I think that is missing it. Right? All of those physical needs, yeah, sure, that's important for to be met, but that also is introducing a power dynamic of let me take care of you, let me help you.
Sure.
We don't want people to take care of us, we want people to be with us, right? Especially our brothers and sisters in Christ. And so if that means like, hey, like let's read this as a small group. Let's read a book that's from a Black author that's talking about a Black church or culturally Black churches in America. Let's do something. Let's reach out. I mean, there's tons of small groups now that are virtual, right?
Right.
From different churches that you can link up with that are predominantly Black churches to say, hey, let's do a Bible study together. Let's meet together. Let's do this together. Let's do this with you. Let's have some sort of book study. Let's read this. Let's pause. Let's not just keep on going with the same old thing and just act like, hey, we're just going to pray this all away. Like that's not, in my mind, that's not what this moment is for. I think that this moment is to be able to pause and to make changes. And some of those changes involve exposure and engagement with other cultural identities, which I think is really important.
I think you've actually been very gracious in saying that we could pray this away when I'm not sure that that's the first thing that we go to. I think the first thing we go to is our pocketbook and say, how can we be benevolent? And and I appreciate what you said about a power over. It can seem that's not something that I would have had in my mind originally in that, and to be praying about that. So because that, I mean, empathy is a big key to that. And
listening and being empathetic. Like, what is going on? Like, why are people upset? You know, like as a psychologist, I always, you know, I meet with people every single week, and I listen, and a lot of times people are like, well, you know, we want to focus in on the behavior, right? But the question is like, well, what is driving the behavior? What is going on inside of this child that they're so angry, right? They're so upset that their behavior, of course, like, you know, if we focused in on the behavior, like, you're going to try to just run around and fix things. Solutions. But with empathy, if you really sit and say, what's going on, buddy? What's going on? Tell me what's happening. Tell me your experience. Tell me your story. And I think that this is a moment where we get a time to be able to say, like, instead of just trying to figure out solutions right away and fix the problem and throw things at the problem, can you actually utilize empathy and listen? Not dismiss, not justify, but to actually listen and to be present with the person who is in pain or this community that is in pain, and ask questions that are introspective of what is going on. How can I hear their pain? What is happening? I think that that's where we really need to start, and jumping to the solutions or being dismissive, they're just really not helpful. They wouldn't be helpful for me as a psychologist, and they're not helpful for us as a community to do the same.
It's really hard for, I like to think that I have at least maybe from what some others have said, I have a high level of empathy, but also with this little fix-it issue that I want to fix the problem. And the first step, you say, is to really listen carefully and interact and ask the right questions. And I think that's so important in communication and stuff. But if I were to take that piece, having had some experience working with some inner city ministries and things like that, I still find myself, this is horrifying to me to even say this out loud, I still find myself concerned about offending someone or saying the wrong thing or asking the wrong questions. And so how do you help me fix that in my own life to where I could just feel comfortable to have a conversation and not worry about what I'm going to say might be offensive?
Yeah, I think that, well, I don't know if I can fix that, right?
Oh, thanks.
Right? Like, I think that there's going to be,
I'm unfixable.
I think that there's going to be a level of discomfort with these types of conversations because they're not to the type of conversations that we typically have. You know, this isn't like, hey, pass the bread, pass the salt, and hey, what do you think about racial reconciliation? You know, like you
This
don't
goes
typically
way deeper.
you don't typically have these dinner. These are not dinner type of conversations for some people. What I would say is that this goes back to that idea of ruptures and repairs. When you are in a relationship for the long haul, there's less anxiety of saying the wrong thing. You know, it's not like you're walking on eggshells, right? And because one, you're willing to, if you do have a rupture, you're willing to have a repair, and there's some sense of what we would call psychological safety that's built around the relationship to say, hey, like, this is an important conversation that we need to have, and I'm committed to being in a relationship with you about having these types of conversations because I think that they're important. And so if we have to fumble through it, and if we have to correct, if I have to say, well, I wouldn't say privilege and blessing, I would say this, if we have to do things like that, that's okay because we are in a committed relationship as brothers and sisters in Christ to be able to say, like, this isn't a one-time thing. This isn't a one-time conversation. This is something that'll be ongoing that we do throughout the lifespan. And so I think that there's a component of that, of being in an engaged relationship with a person that decreases that feeling of like, oh, I don't want to say this. Well, usually you're hiding and you don't want to say that if you feel like it's only going to be a one-time thing. But when you're in a continual relationship with somebody, I think that that decreases it. There's still a level of discomfort that you're going to have to deal with.
I don't like discomfort.
Yeah, I mean,
Do you?
yeah, I don't think anybody likes discomfort. I mean, honestly, it's in some ways it's hard being in a space talking about these conversations. There's a level of discomfort, you know, of being here at a predominantly white church as a black male who's talking about race. There's a level of discomfort that comes with that. But I think that this is so important. I mean, even for like a societal level, I think it's important. But as a Christian, I think that this is huge. In terms of spiritual formation and in terms of sanctification and the process of changing, I think that this is so huge. This is, to me, like, this is our moment as Christians, right? To be able to say, this is why we do things different, and it's because of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. I live differently, and I have these conversations differently, not because I'm black and I'm a psychologist. I do this because I am a Christian first, and I believe that people should be treated equal, right? And that I believe that I really believe that people are made in the image of God. And if I believe that people are made in the image of God, I treat God's creation with grace, with longevity, with patience, with kindness, with respect and dignity and honor. And I think that is, as a Christian, is something that is so salient and so important in this moment.
I appreciate that a ton. It's a bigger and deeper picture than just interacting with another human being, that this is a creation of God that I'm having a conversation with, made in the image of God. And it eliminates my color, and it eliminates your color. And so I appreciate that a ton.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, or, you know, even if, I think about eliminating in it, I think that it makes us even to see that color. And it makes us to be able to see how God made life in color.
Creativity.
And that's the beauty of it. And that's the beautiful world that we get to live in.
I don't mind that you correct me. I don't mind that at all. I appreciate
I hope
that.
I'm doing it with
I get
grace,
it.
right?
I love that. I appreciate it. And Josh, I haven't paid any attention to the time. I'm right on? Okay, good. I told you beforehand,
It's
I don't
okay.
look at the clock,
Yeah.
and they know it.
I'm sure.
And but I want to talk real quickly, if we could, a couple of the values that we have at our church. One of them is we're in this together, and another one is that we fight for people.
Okay.
In the White Evangelical Church, can you see some places where there have been some deficits, where we've missed the mark in caring for our community as a whole, that you could maybe give us some help or some aid in that area?
One, I think that having the conversation right now is not being complicitly silent. I mean, which is huge. We're having the discussion. So even if there are people who are sitting in this auditorium or online who don't agree with the content of what is being spoken between the two of us, right? They don't agree with them. They have problems. There's picking holes into the argument. That is okay, because we're actually having the contextual conversation, right? And so it's going to produce more dialogue, and hopefully, I would say there's more change, more development across that spiritual formation of becoming more Christ-like. But I think that it's important for us to recognize that historically the white evangelical church has been complicitly silent in racial injustice for a very, very long time. And so, and this goes back to, Martin Luther King, C.T. Vivian, Elijah Cummings, Reconstruction even. There has just been slavery. There's just so much in there that the church has been silent about over time. So it's this moment of saying, like, this is one way to break the silence. Right.
Well, I've seen waves of this. I went back and looked at my notes, believe it or not, from 1994, when I was at the first year of Promise Keepers, 60,000 men, Indianapolis. And one of the books that they taught, I bought it right away, was Breaking Down the Walls. And it was all about racial reconciliation. And so in 1994, 60,000 men are hearing about this, and it gets this mountaintop experience, and then it dies off. And it seems like nothing came of that, or very little. I shouldn't say nothing, but very little came of that. What can we do to maybe sustain continual conversation about this, continual interaction? And maybe that's just it. Be willing to do that. But is there something that we can do to sustain some momentum here?
I think that there's, you can implement policies, protocols, procedures, think about like on an organizational level in order to have some sort of sustainment, different hiring practice and stuff like that. For a church, it's a little bit different. Like, there has to be a commitment from the senior leaders, right? To say that this is personally important as the shepherd of this flock, to be able to say, like, I want to have this as a component of any type of leader development in my church, a component of any type of formation in my church, a component of the conversation and the fabric of who we are as Christians in Pontiac, Illinois, right? We want to be marked by people who are multiculturally competent or engaged at least, right? And having some sort of exposure to that. So I think that this comes from the senior leaders of, the local and the global church to say, these issues are important because we read the scriptures, and the way that we interpret the scriptures, we see that it's important to Jesus that he lives life in color and has different backgrounds of all races and all ethnic tribes, tongues, right?
Very clear. Yeah.
Yeah.
Revelation 7.
I mean, it's
tribes,
just
tongues, nations. Clearly.
And I think that sometimes we forget that this is something that is clearly laid out in scriptures, but we overread it, or we dismiss it.
Thanks for putting the onus on the leadership of the church. I appreciate
Hey, man,
that.
it starts from the top,
Yeah,
right?
Just real quickly here as we're wrapping up, and I have not desired in any way, shape, or form to be political. I still don't want to do that in this arena, if at all possible. But I do want us to hear clearly and carefully as a church, and me as an individual from you. We make statements like when we see Black Lives Matter, and I'm going to put white evangelicals, put all lives matter, or babies' lives matter, or which is absolutely true. But setting aside monikers and I'll call it modus operandi of movement, how do we speak to that? How should we speak to that? I'm not asking the question that great, but I would just love to hear your input to that.
I'll give the answer to what I want to answer instead of what you asked. How's that?
Oh, yeah, I think that'd be the best way to answer.
I'm just joking. But I would probably say that when in terms of saying Black Lives Matter, I think Black Lives Matter, period, pause. And as a Christian, I think that we should be able to say Black Lives Matter.
Absolutely.
Period. When people say all lives matter, I think that, there's this dichotomous thinking. Like if I say Black Lives Matter, then I'm also saying that all lives don't matter. Well, in order for all lives to matter, Black lives have to matter, right? And I think about it in terms of, like imagine like an analogy that sometimes I use is like cancer. Like there's breast cancer awareness, there's lung cancer awareness, we have colon cancer awareness, right?
Sure.
And sometimes we set aside times to say, hey, we are only talking about breast cancer awareness this month, and somebody gives a talk on breast cancer awareness and how it's important, and let's put funding and put a lot of attention towards that. Imagine if somebody from the crowd stands up and said, hey, lung cancer matters too. Of course we think lung cancer matters, absolutely. We think that lung cancer matters and all cancer matters, but right now in this time, we're actually focusing a time to set aside to talk about breast cancer because it's important and we're specifically doing that. In the same way, when we're talking about Black Lives Mattering, right, we're setting aside a small part of time to be able to say Black Lives Matter because historically in our context that has not been the case. That has not been a part of the system to say, we believe that Black Lives Matter and this is how we're showing it, right? So I think that, sometimes people get really wrapped around the axles of like, well, I don't want to say Black Lives Matter because that's saying that I'm part of this movement and all that. So, like, we're talking about, do you believe fundamentally that Black Lives Matter? Can you say that? And if you can, I would say that that's something to think about and to inquire about. So I believe that Black Lives Matter. And I don't feel dichotomous about saying that all lives matter. And I don't feel dichotomous with saying that I believe and I'm pro-police and I'm pro-Black and I'm pro the local and global community that we live in. Okay, so I think that dispelling those dichotomous components are really important as Christians in being able to lean into this moment to say we're setting aside a time in history to really focus in on Black lives and racial injustice that's continually been perpetuated in this country.
Thank you so much. Every time we meet, I learn something about you. I learn a lot about me. That I believe there's times when that happens that I need to go back and think through, pray through, and ask God to transform my life, to make me more like his son Jesus, who isn't just a blue-eyed picture on a wall. So I appreciate the time that you've shared with us, and I hope that you, as a church, that we have learned a lot from Dr. Cedric Williams. He is incredibly humble and listens very, very carefully. and I have enjoyed getting to know you.